Thank you. I feel privileged to be able to speak at not only this meeting, any AA meeting, whether it's 3 people or 300 people. What we try to do, I guess, when we're in here for a while is try to express our thanks and share our experience, strength, and hope. And that's what I hope I do. And the biggest thing I think I can ever get at a meeting is if a newcomer's here, and all I'd like to do, whether there's 3 or 3,000 people, is get that newcomer to go at least one more meeting. And that's what I try to strive for. Again, my name is Dick Barry, and I'm alcoholic. My sobriety date is October 18th, 1969. I haven't found it necessary to pick up a drink or a mind-altering substance from that day to this. I get a bit about my drunk log. I'd rather talk more about my recovery, but without a drunk log, I wouldn't be here. And I'll start with, I guess, I come from a relatively small family. My mother was an only child, and my father was an only child. And so I had no aunts or uncles. However, I had a lot of second, third cousins in Ireland. My mother's father came from Dublin, and my father and his parents came from County Cork. So growing up, I got to know a little bit about my heritage. And where I was raised as a boy, there was a lot of ethnic pockets throughout the city of New York. I was born in the borough of Queens, and I was raised in a place called Rockaway Beach, where it was better known at times as Irish Town. And so I watched all of the Irish immigrants and the Irish Americans in the summertime. They'd always have a big party, and they'd have kegs of beer, and they would sing all Irish songs and dance, and it was part of their heritage, and it's passed on to me. And I can tell you that when I look back in retrospect, I never remember ever seeing either of my 3 grandparents or my father when they weren't drinking. The unfortunate part was, as a boy, my father wasn't even 20 years old when I was born yet. He came to this country when he was 15 in 1935. And by the time, the day before his 25th birthday, he and my mom had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and I was the oldest. And it was a very abusive childhood. My father would always abuse my mother verbally and physically, and I was the oldest, so he smacked me around when I come home from school and say, that was for nothing. Now, what'd you do wrong at school today? And I was scared to death of my father, and I was also scared to death of God. And the reason I say that is, I was raised in a Catholic church, and we were taught a fear in God. And some of you that aren't old enough may not understand what I'm about to say. And if we was to eat meat on Friday and miss Mass on Sunday, and you died and you're 9 years old, a couple of days down the road, you die and you go into hell for eternity. Now, I had to believe all that growing up. It was sad, and I did. But today, I have the same God. He's not a fearing God. He's a loving God. It took me a long time to understand what my higher power was all about. Well, anyway, unfortunately, and I'll try to get into my recovery. When I was 12 years old, my father was in the basement of our home, and he got into a fight with a man, and he killed him while they were drinking. And he wound up going to a place called Sing Sing State Prison in Donnemora in upstate New York. And my mother was left with 4 kids and no money. My grandmother, my mother's mother, took my sister Eileen, and she raised my sister Eileen. My mother raised me, my brother Kenneth, and my brother Dennis. And she had to go on her welfare rolls in New York City. And back in 1952, 53, and 54, up to the 60s, I guess, it was embarrassing to be on the welfare rolls. I can remember on more than one occasion, my mother would wait till the sunset to go out to the mailbox to get her welfare check. And she'd always say, Richie, will you come with me? Yeah, I know why she wanted me. And more than one occasion, we'd go to the mailbox, and now the sun set. And my mother would open the mailbox, and there'd be 2 white letters, say, in a brown envelope, which meant the brown envelope was the welfare check. And she had a sigh of relief, she felt so good that, she got that $24.50 on the first of the month and the 15th to raise 3 boys. So when we go to the mailbox and we went through this exercise, We turn around and come in, and Mrs. Murphy across the street would open her window. She was an Irish American. And she'd say, Mrs. Barry, is that your welfare check? And you used to harass my mother. It was embarrassing to be on welfare back in those days. Today, if you don't get your welfare check in the mail, you go right down to City Hall and complain. You know, it became a business, whatever. But this is the experience I went through. Fast forward, I swore to myself that I probably would never drink. This what alcohol does to people. My grandparents, I never saw them sober. They were always drinking and drunk, and my father was abusive. And so unfortunately at 13 years old, my father was away, I guess, a year, and I was 13. And we had these parties, these Irish Americans and Irish immigrants, and they would dance and all. We learned all the Irish ballads and songs, and we learned to dance the Irish jig and whatever. And one night, I remember sitting there, and they asked me to be the bartender of this keg. And one of the parents showed me how to pour a drink. So I was pouring them all night for the adults, and then I decided to help myself. Man, after I had that first drink, that first glass of beer, 15 minutes later, I was 6'5" and I weighed 260. And I said, wow, this shit's powerful. And so, unfortunately, from that day until the day I got sober, it was downhill. But I had a lot of fun, I like to think, when I was drinking. As a result of not having a formal education, I dropped out of high school at 16 to help my mother. And she divorced my father a year and a half after he was in prison. And 2 or 3 years later, she remarried. So now I'm 16 and soon to be 17. And I decided that I wanted to join the Army. I knew that I could get a GED in the Army. And back in those days, we had a draft. And once you were 18, they would draft you for 2 years. But if you were 17 and you joined, you'd have to serve 3 years. So that's what I did. Now, all of my drinking and my drunkalog 90% of it's in the military. And, so if you hear me say things about the Army, I'm not bragging about my time in the military. This is where I did my drinking. People got upset with me one day. We don't want to hear about that Army stuff and all that. And then, if you worked in industry and you got fired, you talk about the job in industry, you got fired. If you were a CEO of a company and you had 5,000 employees, that's what you talk about and you got fired. I didn't have any of that. I didn't have a formal education. And when I went into the military in 1957, at 17 years old, I thought I died and went to heaven. The first time in my life, I had 3 hots in a cot on a regular basis. And wow. And after basic training, I went to advanced infantry training, and now we're allowed to drink at the enlisted man's club on post. And after I went through that, I had signed up to become to go to jump school. I wanted to be a paratrooper, me and this other kid named Collins. And we did. And we went through jump school. Well, basic training was at Fort Devens, basic training was at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And jump school was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I went through all that, and I was fortunate enough to pass, and I didn't quit or to get thrown out. And shortly thereafter, I started liking the military. I never fired a weapon in my life before, and I was good at it. I just liked it. And so we had I guess what they call a formation one day, and the captain said that they needed 16 men from Fort Bragg to go to Fort Gordon, Georgia. They were 16 men short of starting the next class for Ranger training. Anybody want to become a Ranger? And a few of us stepped up, and I did. And I guess they wound up with the 60-man roster. And I was fortunate enough there. I didn't drop out. I didn't get thrown out. And it was hectic. It was tough. And I became a Ranger. Now I'm airborne. I'm a Ranger. I'm with elite units in the military. And got my GED, incidentally, during that period of time when I was waiting to go from one military base to the other. And I had a recruit, a captain, come up to me one day, and he said that my entrance exams were rather high, and he wanted to know if I would stay in the military, if I would take what they call a short discharge and stay in for 7 years, that I could earn a bachelor's degree out of the University of Maryland. And so I did that. I knew I was going to stay in. And so for the next 6 or 7 years, all I did was drink and get in trouble. And the only reason why I didn't get any serious trouble is the units I was in. We always had somebody protecting us, whether it was the general, the colonel, or the sergeants and whatever. We go downtown to get into a fight. They wouldn't lock us up. They bring us back to post. And that was maybe an advantage or perhaps a disadvantage because my drinking excelled. And I was at a point where I was a very vulgar guy. And I didn't care. I fight. When I was a kid, I was scared to death of human beings. I used to get beat up in the school ground by kids. And that wasn't necessarily bullies. It's just kids that beat me up, and I was always crying. Well, I'll tell you, the military made me a different person. And I tell you, to this day, I don't regret being spending the time I did in the Army. I was going to spend 25 to 30 years. I was going to make it a career, and I did get that degree. And fast forward 1966, I had 9 years in the Army, and I was a sergeant. And the Green Beret or the Special Forces weren't around until 1960. And in 1965, I guess it was, I worked for a two-star general. And he suggested that, you've got all these other, you've been to Ranger training and airborne training. You might want to consider Special Forces. And so I signed up. And again, I was fortunate enough to make it through. And I don't know how I did it. It was tough, but I did. And so when that all ended, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I knew I was going to go anyway in 1966, and I did. And my drinking continued in Vietnam. I won't get into what I did over there, but when I came back, I'll give you an example. My career was over. The 25 years were down a chute. And I had 3 children by then. I was married with 3 kids. My father was 19 when I was born. When my daughter Kathleen was born, I was 21. So I guess we all marry young. And by the time I was 27, I had 4 children. When I came back from Vietnam a year later, Kevin was born, and I had 2 in the middle. And so my drinking excelled to a point where I had about 6 or 7 months left on that enlistment. And I could have re-enlisted and not gone back to Vietnam, maybe Saigon punching a typewriter or something. And that wasn't even the safe haven. Getting out of the Army is when my drinking really excelled to a point where it damn near killed me. In a 14-month period, I was in the Veterans Hospital in Boston 3 times. The first 2 times at 27 and 28, I had an enlarged liver. And just before I was 29, the third stayed there for 6 weeks. They took a biopsy, and I had cirrhosis of the liver when I was 28 or 29 years old. And that didn't scare me. I weighed 130 pounds when I went in the hospital. My normal weight and the shape I was in was 190 pounds, and I was solid. But it had gone down to that. And the arrest, the arrest, and the fights in the barroom and all these other things that aren't important, but this is what got me here. And so from the time I was 27 until I was 29, I had found AA, and I knew about AA because my father went to AA while I was in prison, and we would write back and forth, and he would tell me what the program was all about and that he's never going to drink again because of the program. The day he got out, he drank, and he never was able to get this thing. And so in those 2 years, with all the trouble and all the fights I had, and my family was so sick of reading my name in a newspaper a couple of times a week, 4 or 5 times a month, drunk and disorderly, assault and battery, fighting with cops, fighting in the bar rooms, and having to go to court and pay fines and go to jail for 30 days or 60 days at a time. And having 4 children, was pretty much following my father's footsteps. And so I woke up one morning, and I never forget this. It was probably the 16th or the 17th of October, 1969. Sick as a dog. I mean, I was sick. And 4 things happened to me that day. 4 things happened to me that day that it wasn't planned. It just happened. I think divine intervention. It was the last time I drank. It was the last barroom fight I got in. The last time cops arrested me. And the following morning, I left the jailhouse, went upstairs to the courtroom. It was the last time I wound up going before Judge Comerford. And I was supposed to go to the county jail for a year this time. And somehow, and I won't get into it, I know why I didn't. It was more than divine. It was divine intervention, and an AA guy happened to know the judge, and I didn't know that for 5 years. And so when I went home, I got to tell you, I was sick. My wife was so upset, and it was on the 17th of October. It was a Friday. And My wife says, you're going back to AA at work when you were there, and for 3 months or 4 months at a time or 2 weeks or whatever. He says, you're going to kill yourself, and you're going to leave me with 4 children. And she says, I'm calling Louis McCarty. He was an old Irish-American friend of mine. And Louis was in the program 4 or 5 years before me. And I said to him, like, don't call Louis. Please don't call Louis. She says, I'm calling Louis. She says, Louis will straighten you out. I said, don't call any of those AA people. I'll be all right. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it. Well, I passed out on the couch, and there's a knock on the door 2 hours later. Who is it? Louis McCarty. And Louis said, hey, you son of a bitch, have you had enough yet? And I said, oh, man, Louis. I said, Louis, I'm sick. He said, no, we're going to a meeting right now. I said, Louis, I can't. I'm sick. I was vomiting blood. I mean, that was normal for me to first it started green and yellow bile and then blood, and I couldn't eat. That's why I was so thin. I just couldn't eat. And so I promised Louis I'd go the next day. And the next day was a Saturday, October 18th, my sobriety day. And Louis picked me up, and I started going to meetings with Louis. And I felt so embarrassed going to some of these meetings I had attended for the last couple of years, thinking that they were all going to talk about me. Here's that kid again, and he's screwed up. So I remember one night, and I don't want to forget this, I went on my own to a meeting outside of Boston. I was so embarrassed. I went to go to a meeting I hadn't gone to before. And this was the turning point in my sober life. I'm going, I knew where the church was, but I had never been there. And I park and I go down this alleyway, and there's a fella at the door, an old timer at the time. And he says to me, he said, young man, are you looking for the AA meeting? And I said, yes, sir. And he says, well, it's right in here. I said, well, thank you. And he puts his hand out, and this is the words I'll never, ever forget. He says to me, well, shake the hand of a man whose hand used to shake. How do you remember that? I'm shaking his hand, and I'm shaking because I shook for 2 months after I came in. I couldn't stop. And so he's an Irish American. This guy he became good friends of mine. He was about 15, 20 years older than me at the time. And he says to John, he yells, hey, John, we got a new pigeon out here. He says, give him a cup of coffee. Make it a half a cup. I don't want to spill it on my floor. And he says, okay. And then he says, oh, get him a seat up front. I want him to sit up front. He says, there's no seats up front. Good. He says, have him sit next to me. I said, what did I didn't volunteer for this. I just, what's this stuff all about? And so that was the start of my journey to sobriety, and I paid attention. I started going to meetings with different guys. You know, it's funny. Some of the guys that knew me when I was in and out, the longest period I ever had of sobriety in those 2.5 years was 3 months. And even after I was sober 3 months, they kept an eye on me. They figured I'm going out again. The guys, the old timers that really cared, they were hardcore guys. You know, they didn't say you're going to get a sponsor. They show you who your sponsor was. And they didn't say you have to do service work. We'll tell you what you have to do when the time is right. And get yourself a sponsor. So I went to pick this guy, and he says, it was the guy that we were going to recommend anyway. And I said, well, that was good. And he was kind of a mild-mannered guy. And I said, man, I'm glad I got this guy, not those tough Irishmen over there. Well, this guy wound up being tougher than those guys. He wasn't mild-mannered. I mean, he would tell me when to go to bed, when to get up. I'd have to raise my hand like a kid in the 3rd grade. May I go to the bathroom and do something? But he did what I didn't want to do at the time. He took me through the 12 suggestive steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the recovery program. I didn't want to do that. I didn't know anything about the steps or AA. I just wanted to get sober. And it took me a long time to get through the withdrawal part of this thing and to start paying attention. I wanted to drink almost every day for 3 or 4 months. And I knew I couldn't, and I was working. I was very fortunate that I worked construction. So on a construction site, you could always hide in one of the buildings you were building and drink and have a couple of shots of vodka during the morning to get you through till noontime. And you started the rat race all over again. And so when I started going to meetings, there's so many things that he told me through the years. And one of them was, you can't do this for your wife and your kids. You can't do this for your parents or your siblings. You can't do it for your boss. He says, you got to have to do this for you. He says, if you want what we have, do what we do. And I said, well, I have a family. No, you're not doing it for your family. You're doing it for you, because if you keep drinking, you're not going to have a job. You're not going to have a family, your parents, all of these things. And that's how they did it back in the day. And So I paid attention. I worked the steps, and this guy was so thorough with the 12 and 12. And I felt good. And then here's a funny thing. One day my sponsor says to me, well, you've been sober 4 or 5 months now. He says, you got to start doing service work. I said, yeah. So what do you want me to do? And he says, I want you to make coffee. He said, John's been making coffee for 2 years now. And he said, he wants a break. He'll show you how to make it. I said, well, that's a big urn over there. I said, I don't even make coffee at home. That thing is huge. And I said, I don't think I want to do the coffee thing. He said, well, clean ashtrays. I said, well, I don't smoke. He said, what the hell do you want to do? I'll do the coffee. 2 years later, he comes over to me. He says, this kid, Kevin. I said, yeah, he's been around a while. It looks like he's going to make it. He said, I want you to show Kevin how to make coffee. And I said, no, have Kevin clean the ashtrays. I said, I'm the coffee guy. And so it's funny how things change in your life. You know, in the program, it is so slow. It comes slowly, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so doing the things I thought I would do, should do, and I was doing them. They said 90 meetings in 90 days. I remember being told that in 18 months, I might have missed one meeting. I think it was on a Thanksgiving when we had turkey at home, and the family was all there, and they were all happy to know that I was sober. And my parents were still alive at the time. My father had since got out of prison, gone back in, got out, gone back in. And he wound up dying at 54 years old in a vacant lot between two high-rise apartment buildings in New York City. He didn't have any identification on him. He took his fingerprints. It took him 2 months to find me. Now I'm living in Massachusetts. And the only reason they could find me was I visited my father when he was in Sing Sing when I was sober a couple of years, and he was still doing his time, and I no longer feared him because of my training and stuff. And he was my father. And so they took my fingerprints there, and they stripped you down, and they looked every cavity in your body. I said, I'm not a prisoner. I'm just visiting one. That's how they found me. They did some research and found out that he had a son living in Massachusetts and a couple of brothers in New York. They didn't know who they were. And they told me he died, and what happened, it wasn't foul play, but he just had a fatty liver, and his heart went, and he was 54. And so that was hard to take, and because I love my father, and it took me a long time being sober to forgive him for what he did to my mother and us kids. I didn't realize at the time that alcohol was the main villain in this whole thing. And it became like 3 or 4 grandparents that they all died young. And so I can remember, this is a little humorous. There's a person on here. It's a woman. She didn't ask me to say this, but she gets a kick out of it every time I mention it. I was sober about 9 months, and I had the 35th anniversary, international anniversary of Alcoholics Anonymous in Miami, Florida. And my sponsor says, we got to go to, he had about 2.5 years at the time. He says, we got to go to that anniversary. I said, no, I can't, man. I said, I got a wife and kids. I said, I'm trying to make amends to people. I'm paying the bills, and I just can't do it. He says, whenever you didn't have money and you wanted to drink, did you find the money? I said, of course. He said, well, find the money for this. I'm not paying for your hotel room or your flight. All right. So I didn't know what to expect. This was July of 1970. I had 9 months at the time, and I lived in Boston. We flew down. And this is funny. We're sitting in the back. There's probably 6,000 to 10,000 people. It wasn't a large amount back in those days. I think the last one they had in Atlanta had about 60 or 70,000. But I'm sitting there, and I kept telling Joe, I said, there's a couple empty seats up front in the second row there. I've been looking. There's nobody sitting there. He said, no, it's probably security. And I said, no, the security's walking all around. Those are empty seats. Let's go up. He says, no. And I said, get back here. And I ran up. I got up. I walked down there. And I looked, and there were these security badges with a name on tag on it. And I just threw one around my neck, and there was about 10 feet to the stage, and was 4 or 5 feet up. And I knew that Bill W. was in the back. And so I make like I'm a security guy, 29. I'm so stupid at the time. And I went behind the curtain, whatever that you call it. And he was in a wheelchair, and I put my hand on his, and I said, thank you, Bill, for starting Alcoholics Anonymous. It saved my life. And all he said to me was, son, keep coming. Just keep coming. That's all he said. And I was shocked. I mean, I'm an extrovert, and I couldn't think of anything to say to him at the time. So I turned around, and I was walking down the steps. The security guy said, "Hey, you." He said, "You part of?" He says, "Are you part of us?" I said, "Yeah, I am. I'm alcoholic." You know, I was being a wise ass. He said, "No, you part of security." I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Give me that guy." So I go back to my seat, and my sponsor would not talk to me. He says, you haven't learned a damn thing in Alcoholics Anonymous. He says, I'm allowed to fire you. And I said, well, fire me. He said, no. He said, I'm not going to fire you till you get your ass right. You get sober. I'm sick of your list. And so that was the last time he ever had to correct me, I think. And so my life went on. And so many things happened to me as things went on. For example, the town I lived in, it was west of Boston, it had 40,000 people. And as I mentioned earlier, they were reading my name in the paper. They'd call my wife, my mother-in-law, my mother, all of my family, my siblings. My siblings couldn't understand why they were all young. But why does he drink? Didn't he see what happened to the old man? What's the matter with you, Richie? What's the matter with you? And I was hooked, I guess. And so I was working construction at the time, and another fellow in AA who I think had something to do with me not going to jail that last time I was arrested. He said to me in a meeting one day, he said, "Dick," he said, you got a half a brain. He said, you don't have to work construction the rest of your life. He said, why don't you get into sales? He said, you got a gift of gab. You'd be a good salesperson. And he was in the insurance business. And I thought about it. And then a couple of nights later, I read in the local newspaper, there's a free real estate course at the YMCA. So I signed up, and 8 weeks later, I take the state exam, and I passed it. I got a broker's license in Massachusetts. And so for the next 2 years, I sat open houses on the weekend, and I worked construction. And one day, after a couple of years, I realized that I could make more money selling real estate than I can fighting the elements in the winter, the snow and all of that in New England in the winter, and then the hot days in summer. I mean, the days in Boston, just as hot as they are down here in Florida. It's 92. If it's 90 degrees in Boston and 92 down here, how do you tell the difference? So I decided to work for this guy, and I worked for another year or two. And then I was very fortunate. I was successful at what I did. And it took to it like a duck to water. So there was an old timer getting ready to retire, and he wanted somebody to buy his business. Well, the business wasn't worth anything, but the value was his building. And I was very fortunate. And I might add back up a bit. When I was sober about 3.5, 4 years, I bought my first house. And God, my rent was $50 a month at the veteran project that I lived in. It was for veterans. And now I buy this house for $17,400. My payment's $188 a month. How the hell am I going to pay this? I'm sober 3.5 years. But it worked out, obviously. And so as time went on, in the very town I lived in, everybody knew me drinking. And not everybody, I mean, a number of people, the important people, I guess. And one day in a coffee shop, this is a big thing up there, business, white collar guys, blue collar guys and gals would meet and have coffee in the morning on their way to work and discuss sports and other things. And one day the state representative, his name was Angelo Bacusi, better known as Stiff Bacusi, says, "Dick, you got a minute?" I said, "Yes, Stiff, what's up?" He said, "Let's go outside." And I said, "Oh, shit, one of my agents must have screwed up. I'm going to lose my license now." I said, "What's up, Stiff?" He says, "Jack McLaughlin wants to talk to you." I said, "About what?" He says, he wants to appoint you to the planning commission. I said, "I don't know anything about planning." He said, "Well, there's a woman retiring. He wants you on there." He said, "You got to do it." I said, "Steph, I know nothing about." I said, "Well, at least go see Jack." And I said, "Okay." And I went saw the mayor, and he talked to me for a while. And he said, "We've been watching you." And he said, "Man, you've come a long way in the last 4 or 5 years, whatever it was." And I said, "Yeah, Jack." And I think Jack was one of us, but I can't take his inventory. He died a couple of years ago. And I was appointed, and I learned how to be a planner. And so the 2 or 3 years after that, in the same town, I get a call from one of the directors at a bank in that town. He said, "The president of the bank wants to talk." I'm thinking, oh my God, I screwed up, and one of my agents screwed up. And I go in to see him, and he says, "I want you to serve on one of the boards in the bank." I said, "I don't know anything about banking." And he said, "No," he said, "you were recommended by somebody." And I found out later it was the same guy that talked to the judge Don, the same guy that told me to get in sales. And he never said anything to me. I found that out because he was a director at the bank. I didn't know that. And so I served on one of the boards there. And within time, I became one of the directors myself. I was going to write a book from Skid Row to City Hall. I said, nah, that's not going to work. So I kept going to meetings and going to meetings. And, I became so successful that I did exactly what my sponsor told me. He said, you got to get active in the program. I did the service work. I was chairing meetings, I was making coffee, cleaning those ashtrays, setting up the halls and setting them down. I'm 80 years old, and in our house down, I still do it. I still go there on Fridays. We have a big meeting on Friday. Get there at 3:30. The meeting's at 5:30, and help this other person set up the place. I just enjoy doing it. It's service. It's giving back what was so gracefully given to me. And so I understood all that, and things started to happen. And as time went on, and I started listening, I would hear things, cliches that helped me, and different things that other people were doing. And I might add that usually when I share a meeting like this, I start by saying that 85% of what you hear me sharing is not my original thought. It's things I heard from people in the program that helped me get through just one day without picking up a drink. And that was so important to me, learning how to do it one day at a time. If you don't pick up a drink today, you can't get drunk. Well, that's easy. Try it. And so I started doing the things I did. My sponsor would tell me, Dick, you got to put that cork in the bottle, man, just early on. He says, because you go out there again, it's going to kill you. You got a living condition. And your father went to prison for killing a man. And he said, you're going to either wind up in one of three places: a penal institution like your father, a mental institution, or an early grave. That's the only three options I had. And it made sense. And so I started listening. Then after I'm listening. And after a while, I listened to learn. I wanted what you guys had. And things started happening to me. And, I always had a lot of, in those 2 years I was in and out, I often went, I'm watching the clock here. I often went to bar rooms after the meeting back in the day. And, my sponsor knew that I was honest with him when I took the fourth step. And he made a comment to me one day. He says, when you were in and out of those bar rooms, he said, you can't go in there. You can't have one drink. It's not going to happen. We tried to tell you that. And I said, yeah. He said, let me give you an analogy of what this means. He said, Dick, if you go into a barber shop and you sit in that barber shop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. If you sit in the bar room long enough, you keep ordering them Coke, you're going to get sick of drinking Coke. You put a shot of rum in there. I said, yeah, that's what I used to do. And so it was always things like that. And then I said to him one day, I said, I'm 30 years old now and I got kids. I said, maybe I ought to move to Florida. And this is before I bought my business. And I said, started my business. Maybe I can change my life. Answers for that. He said, well, let me give you an example, Dick. He said, you put a donkey on a freight train and you ship that donkey to Florida, California, Alaska, wherever you're going to ship that donkey. When it gets there, it's still a donkey. Nothing changes. And I said, oh, really? Okay. And I had to listen to this guy and listen to all this stuff. And, at the time, it didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. But as time went on, it did. And he would tell me simple things, and the old timers and the people before me and the people after me would say things like, Dick, you got to learn to utilize the program. Don't analyze these steps and these traditions. He says, people have been trying to do that since 1935. He said, you got to utilize the tools of this program one day at a time if you want to stay sober. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, one other thing, Dick. He said, you just got to change one thing in your life. And I said, what's that? He said, everything. Your old habits are bad habits. He says, you got to change your sandbox and your playmates. And I was wondering, what is sandbox and playmates? The sandbox was the bar room. The playmates were the guys I hung out with and shot pool with and watched football games. Now in AA, it's AA people, and it's the program. That was the difference in what he was trying to explain to me. And as time went on, I started sponsoring men. I felt so good about trying to get back what was so gracefully given to me. Made me feel good. I would say when a guy went out, I get sick. Oh God, what did I do wrong? But my sponsor, you didn't do anything wrong. He said, you bounced in and out for a couple of years. He said, not everybody makes it on their first term around here. And so I said, okay. And another thing, I was taking everybody's inventory, going to meetings with him. And one day he leans, I said, Dick, he said, you got to stop talking about people. I wasn't saying negative things. I was saying, I don't know what I was saying. He said, let me give you an example. He always gave me examples, this guy. He said, Dick, he said, let me tell you what you have to do just to stop taking people's inventory. He said, you take an imaginary hula hoop, he said, put it above your head and drop it to the floor. He said, now, what happens inside that hula hoop, Dick, is your business. What happens on the outside of the hula hoop is none of your business. You got that? And oh, yeah, I guess I do. I guess. And it makes sense, you know, and forget about talking about other people. And, you know, he also explained to me that he said this was he. And now he said it was me. He said, when I came in here, Dick, he says, I was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And neither was I the brightest bulb in the chandelier. He said, you got to get in the middle of the herd. If you want what we had, you got to do what we do. And get in the middle. Don't hang on the outskirts. You'll pick up a drink. Get in the middle. And, I understand what he was saying. And it was making a lot of sense to me. And I just kept going and going. He was this guy was like a mind reader. He almost knew what every move I was going to make. And I appreciated all the things he was saying to me. And, and I says to him one day, and to the other old timers, wasn't all my sponsor, Joe. I says to him one day, I says, how many different kinds of alcoholics are there? The high bottom guys that drink top shelf whiskey, the guys that drink wine or champagne or vodka or whatever. And he said, no, Dick. He says, get that out of your head. I said, well, how many kinds of alcoholics are there? He says, just two. I said, oh, he said, what are the two? And this is what he said to me. Men and women. That's all you have to know. That's what it is. And the degrees of alcoholism, there's no degrees of alcoholism. There's degrees of trouble. How much trouble do you want to make for yourself? How much more can you take? And, I don't know. And he explained to me that the mental obsession precedes the physical compulsion. And what he meant by that is, and I heard him say this, and I've heard it many times since. He said, Dick, he said, the left side of your brain is manufacturing horse shit, and the right side is buying it. And once you're convinced you can pick up a drink and not have any problems, now the physical compulsion takes in. You take that first drink, you're off to the races. You ain't going to stop. And he was right. And so, and I learned other things too about the steps. I truly believe that the steps keep us from committing suicide. And the traditions, and a lot of people don't read those traditions. I do it with my sponsors, and I live the tradition. The traditions will prevent you from committing homicide. And I said, wow. I said, oh, okay, I guess you're right. And so, he would tell me other things like, praying to God is fine. He says, but praying to God, listening is what you got to do. He says, that's meditation. Your higher power will talk to you, not verbally. You got a feeling inside that you're doing something wrong and you need to reverse your course. And I said, yeah. And, I remember also hearing people say this, and so true, that if you want to hear about a miracle, go to a church or a synagogue. The pastor or the rabbi will quote miracles in the Bible, and there are miracles in the Bible, and I knew that as a kid growing up. And he also would say to me, if you want to see a miracle, go to an AA meeting. Keep coming. You're going to see miracles. And I like to think we're all miracles. I mean, this thing didn't happen to me by accident, And it's simple things like, it doesn't make any difference, Dick, whether you come in here from Yale or jail, Park Avenue or the park bench. We have a bolt that'll fit any nut that comes through that door if they want what we have. And I said, oh, okay. And this one didn't happen overnight. This is over a 2-year period. He's babysitting me. And now I'm passing all this stuff on to my sponsees like I'm a genius, like I know it, man. And it wasn't that I learned these from people before me. And not only my sponsor, I keep referring to him, but it's the old timers that would hammer me. I can remember I had 90 days of sobriety, and you couldn't speak in Boston at a discussion meeting or at the podium until you had 90 days. Now I'm at a discussion meeting and I'm ready to roll, man. I said, it's 90 days. I put my hand up and I said, this guy Eddie was chairing the meeting. I said, my name is Dick. And he said, stop right there. Stop right there. He said, Dick, you got nothing to offer me. You got nothing to offer me. So you sit here and listen. And after a while, you'll listen and learn. You've been in and out of this thing for a couple of years now. He said, sit down and shut up. And here's what he said that pissed me off. Take the cotton out of your ears and stick it where the sun don't shine. How many times have you heard that? I said, oh, what's this AA stuff all about? And so, it's, I don't know. It just, there's so many different things that helped me, and I would hear things like recovery begins when anger leaves you. So you can't be angry. You can't be pissed off at the people outside. You got to make amends to those folks, And I said, well, I didn't piss everybody off. He said, no, but what was your part in the people that you did piss off? Were they all wrong? And I said, no, it takes two to tango, I guess. And, I don't know. He said, he would say so many, these guys they were so sincere about helping people. They would go out of their way to help people. You talk about AA meetings. We used to go to AA meetings back in the day for an hour and a half at night. It was 8:30 at night until 10 o'clock. But we'd have an AA meeting in the car on the way to the meeting. We'd be at the meeting and have an AA meeting. And on our way home, and we had to stop for ice cream or another cup of coffee. Oh, man, these guys, I got to go to work tomorrow. And they wanted to make sure that I had sweets in me. And they said, eat candy and have that ice cream. And they always thought that this guy may come home from a meeting like he did early on, get in his car and go down to the bar rooms. They don't close at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was how much the concern they had. I'm talking about early on. I don't know. I could hear things like, how did that go? Your life won't change until you change everything in it, because you got to go, from where you were to where you are today, and the growth period of being in the program, and how important it is that, you get back to those are gracefully given to you. And, there's so many things that I learned in the program, and I know I'm getting close here. I could talk for an hour on the bottom lip, put these babies together, we'd be here till 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I wouldn't repeat myself. But I just like to reach the new people. Let me tell you about new people today. I was 29 when I came in. Believe it or not, I was one of the youngest guys in the room. There weren't very many women. And today they're coming in 16, 18, 20, and 25. And I tell these new people when they came in, I said, you know something? You stay with this program, you're going to add a lot of years to your life. You won't have to go through what some of us went through. And also you're going to add a lot of life to your years. A lot of good things are going to happen to you if you just pay attention. And so I've been trying to get back what's so graciously given to me since I came in here. And, when you talk about success, and I mentioned the things, and I don't always mention the fact that, I had opportunities to be on a planning commission, a bank board, and all that. That's not important. I didn't come in here for material things. I didn't come in to become a millionaire. I come in here to get sober. And what I did with my life after I got sober was strictly up to me. My sponsor couldn't tell me what to do. So you got to do what you got to do. And, it's funny. I've only had one sponsor in 51 years. His name is Joe, and he lives in Malvern, Florida, which is about a 3-hour ride from where I live. He's 88 years old now. He'll have 54 years on June 10th. And he's not in good health now. And I talked to him all through the years. And I'd go, hey, Joe, how you doing? I want to know how he's doing, because he was in ill health. And he said, I'm doing fine. He said, how many sponsees do you have? I said, no, ask me how I'm feeling, Joe. He said, how many sponsees do you have? You giving back what was given to you? I said, Joe, can I talk to you about the weather? And so, there was no weather. He said, it's hot and humid here in Florida. That's the end of that talk. And so, I don't know. And let me, I'm up now. What I try to tell new people is find a higher power, find a sponsor, and work the steps. And this is what I heard when I was sober about a year. A man say this, it's not original, and I use it to this day, and that is, I pray every night. I can't remember the last time I went to bed that I didn't talk to my higher power. And I go through my ritual, and when I end my prayer, I end it like this, because I heard somebody say this 50 years ago. He said, God, thank you for what you've given me. Thank you for what you've taken away from me. And God, thank you for what you've left me. And that's how I end my prayer. And I heard that from a man many, many years ago, and it's worked for me. And, I could go on a lot longer, but maybe I should end it right there before I start talking for another hour. So thank you folks for listening. I appreciate it.